So should we get cracking then, Martin?
Let's go, yeah.
All right, why not?
So why are we here, Alison?
I can't remember, actually, Martin. Oh, yes. It's the Guide to Curriculum, Assessment and Progression.
Do you know, I thought it was something like that.
Yeah. Can anybody hear us?
Let's hope so. Well, somebody says, yippee, I have sound.
Ah, and Anna Gower can hear us. Excellent.
Lots of people can hear it. Oh,
right.
Gosh, there's more than one person out there.
Right.
That's very encouraging.
In that case, let's get going, shall we?
Let's get going.
Right. Okay, so, oh, no, wrong button. That's not helpful. Next. We're going to get the hang of this very soon, aren't we, Martin?
Shall we just apologise to everybody in advance that we're just working through some interesting technological stresses that we're having here. But I think we're there. Okay, we're there.
Right.
Go.
Here we go. So, we're going to have two sessions today, split by some questions in the middle. So, we're going to talk to each other and to you with slides for around 20 minutes. And then we're going to answer some questions. If you've got any questions, please keep putting them up as we go along. And good to see you're so tech savvy, somebody said.
Yes, and we can see the question. If you write in the box, which on our screen is bottom left, we can see what you've just written. So that's obviously really good. So keep those coming. Gosh, I feel like one of those people on the radio, on the wireless.
On the wireless, yes. It is wireless as well. So the first session we're going to be looking more at curriculum and how curriculum might link later, hopefully will link later to assessment and progression, but to kind of unpick some things around that. And
we're also going to be looking at the ways in which these assessment and progression join up and should and can join up in the way that you think and the way that you plan. That's what we're hoping to do.
So today we were thinking that the new curriculum is actually a great opportunity, whether or not you're following the national curriculum, but to kind of refresh and revise and revisit and reflect on your music education in your school, in your setting, whatever that may be. And we know that some schools have to follow the national curriculum and others don't, and they're just mindful of it. But really, it's about these points that we've put up here, making it more relevant to young people's lives and to education, and to make it the musical learning more musical.
We're concerned as well that assessment in music often has a tendency not to be terribly musical. So one of the things we're trying to do is to join up thinking between musical learning and musical assessment, so that everything becomes more musical, which is thoroughly logical, but sometimes it's felt to be a bit lacking. We're also concerned in the next bullet, where it says to make our music curriculum more locally appropriate, that what we really don't feel is appropriate is a one-size-fits-all policy. Every school is different. Even two schools on the opposite side of the road are going to be different. And so what musical learning looks like in your school, don't worry if it's very different from what it looks like in somebody else's school. That's how it should be.
I've been running some seminars over the last few weeks for the ISM, and something that's come to light is the range of amount of time which people have for music, and whether that's taught by a specialist or a generalist. But even in secondary schools, that can range from around 15 hours a year to an hour a week, or sometimes 2 hours a week across Key Stage 3. So obviously it makes sense that the music is going to look vastly different.
One of the things that Goran Folkestad has written about is this first quotation here. A music teacher never meets musically ignorant, untutored or uneducated pupils. And we're starting from the assumption that there's music out there all the time. It's very difficult for people to avoid it. I've had doctoral students who've looked at the musical utterances of very, very young children. And so we can go back to very early ages to see that there is musical experience there. Now, whether we then think that this is the sort of musical experience or knowledge which is appropriate for what we want to be developing in schools, that's a very different issue. But I think it's quite important that at whatever stage we are, we're not really dealing with people who are a blank slate.
We're also working on the premise that the core musical activity actually starts in the classroom, and that's where every child gets their core entitlement from in the first instance. And schools and music educations which are thriving are schools which can successfully kind of have an overlap and a conversation between what goes on in the classroom and how that springboards into extracurricular, bringing in what goes on in the community and making music at the heart of the school in this very joined up way.
One of the problems we have is that the word music covers so many things. So at its very simplest, music for some people is notation on the page. Music for other people is sounds in the air. And so when we talk about music, one of the problems for educators is being quite clear on what we're actually talking about. And so one of the guiding principles for us is the one on this last bullet here. Making music is more important than musical information.
So that brings us on to the new national curriculum. And this is just one way of analysing the new national curriculum. I made a Wordle of this, and the larger the word, the more times it appears in the curriculum. And the reason I did this is because I was kind of a little bit fed up with people saying to me, oh, the new national curriculum is all about history, or it's all about notation. And sometimes, you know, the history side of things switched people on because they thought they could do that, but not the musicking part. And I wanted to find a way to show that the national curriculum is actually still, and much, you know, the underpinning of it is very practical. It's about performing, playing, composing, doing so with a really good quality. And I think, I hope that comes through.
I think it's really interesting that one of the big words is understand. And so along with those other words, we've got that one of understanding. But I think importantly in music, this is understanding evidence through performing, understanding evidence through composing. And so there's a variety of things that this Wordle usefully tells us. And I think as well it's a useful reference for teachers when they're writing their own curricula, their own programs of study, to go back and say, am I really getting this? Is what I'm doing really coming from the national curriculum, or am I overlaying things which, when I really get down to it, aren't there? Can I have an anecdote for a moment?
Go on.
I remember a geography teacher telling me that they were really worried about the place of volcanoes and how they figure in the national curriculum. And when they actually went back to the national curriculum document, they didn't figure there at all. And so I do wonder sometimes as to whether we are guilty of trying to insert our own volcanoes into the music curriculum.
Something else that relates to this is that the National Plan for Music Education effectively looked at music as thinking as a musician and acting as a musician. And actually, the reason that I think that's relevant is because the understanding part and some of the other words around this are where the two things definitely overlap.
Absolutely.
Moving on.
So if we look at the foundations of the new curriculum, there's all the words that you'd expect to be there, composing, performing and listening, but with the addition of critical engagement. And I think it's worth just unpicking those a little bit for a little while and thinking about what does each of them mean and what do they mean for us in terms of the curriculums that we're going to be writing and the way that we're thinking about that in terms of programs of study for the kids we're going to be teaching.
One of the $50 million questions I keep getting asked is what's the difference between the national curriculum before and the curriculum as it is now? Because actually, in terms of Key Stage 1 and 2, the document's not of a dissimilar size, but of Key Stage 3, it's definitely shrunk in size, but not in importance.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that is interesting about it too is that last time the national curriculum was changed, gosh, I sound like one of the, I remember when all this was fields. Last time when the national curriculum, sorry, that teachers said, because the assessment hasn't changed, the curriculum hasn't changed. But I think that this time round, because we now know about levels being removed, the assessment has changed. And we'll come on to that in a bit more in a minute. But there's some real questions there in terms of what should be going on in the new curriculum.
I think the key in here that says critical engagement as well as a kind of word that comes out from the national curriculum, again cements the idea of thinking and acting as a musician. And Roger remembers the last 4 national curriculum.
Yes, me too, Roger.
Right.
Go on, you can start.
Right, we've got a lot to think about really in terms of assessment and what we actually want. So some of the work I've been doing recently and the thinking with people is about valuing. What do you value in the music education in your school? What is tending to happen is people are just cutting to the bottom line and going, right, how am I going to assess this, without working out what it is they value and what it is they want to assess. So the way we've tried to structure the webinar today is to give you some questions, some key questions in your own practice to kind of think about as you go through. And when I've been doing this with even the local teachers in the seminars and also the ISM seminars, it's been really, really powerful getting people to think about what it is that they value in their music education, and whether that is actually just something from the classroom or something that is more holistic. And definitely what's been coming through are the more holistic kind of things which people really value, things like the sense of community. We want you to think about how flexible is your curriculum. Will it be flexible and adaptable for children coming in from lots of different places? Will you be able to adapt it in future years for different children?
I think it might be worth just looking at that bullet, that what choices will you make as the composer if people haven't heard that?
Okay, so what did I say? Go on.
No.
After you.
Oh, okay. These are the choices that you make as the composer of the music curriculum. And we talked a few minutes ago about what's actually on the national curriculum, but then those practices for you have to find their outworking from what's on the national curriculum in terms of the choices that you make as the composer of the music curriculum. And an almost fatuous example is that if you're going to teach the blues, that means you can't teach something else because the space the blues is taking up can't be used twice. So what are the choices that you're making as the composer of the curriculum? What have you chosen in, if that's not really bad English, which means that you've had to leave something out in order to put in the things that you've chosen. So what choices are you making? And then onto the final one, how flexible is your curriculum? What happens if you decide that something should be in? How are you able to deal with that? And what can you do?
So onto the framework. I suspect some of you might have seen this already, and it's very small on here, but you can download all of our work on this from the ISM website, which is ism.org/national curriculum. Thank you, Martin.
I'm trying to hold it so you can see that it's actually a reasonable size, so that even people with my poor vision can actually see it.
I've split it down on the next few slides, but we're thinking of this as the thinking framework for the curriculum for assessment and progression. And the reason I started calling it a thinking framework is because it follows through. It can help you to obviously think about what is it that you actually want from this. So if we go on to the next slide, what is it that you're building on? How are you establishing it? Do you establish it? So what's happened before?
And I think these questions, these are all how questions on this slide. How do you establish it? Then really are points for thinking about, because once again, as we've said before, these are your kids in your schools, you know about them. So once you've established what you're doing, how do you establish the next steps? And one of the things that we keep going to come back to, if that's not really bad, oh gosh, I seem to have lost the ability to speak, is how do you establish the next step? So if you work out where the kids are now, then what are they going to do next? And how does this work through as progression? And one of the things for progression to think about is that, is it accumulative? Are you building things up as you go along, or are you working out where you're going to go? And there'll be a lot more on this later. But how do you establish the next steps?
Also, pupil expectations come from a wide range of sources. So, for example, when they come round to your school on the open evening, be it to your junior school, your infant school, or to your secondary school, in particular in secondary schools, children get to see lots of children playing musical instruments. It builds an expectation. The late Janet Mills did a lot of work, obviously through her job on this, and her book Music in the School talks about some of the expectations which were then built on by the work of Hargreaves and Marshall. So when children come into your school, they have an expectation that they are likely to be doing something which will be musical, engaging them musically. So finding out about these expectations and making sure that you try to somehow meet them is really, really important.
I think there's a really important statement here from Robin Hamilton from Ofsted. As the national curriculum levels disappear, I respectfully ask you not to replace them with another set of numbers. I've had so many conversations with teachers who basically have asked me to reinvent the national curriculum levels in a different way. And I think it's important that if they're being taken away, that we don't just put them back in a different way, just calling them something else. I think the same problems will be going. So the problem for national curriculum levels is the way that they were interpreted and then forced upon teachers. So in their initial conception, they were only designed to be used at the end of the key stage, and then they've grown and grown since then, and I now see national curriculum levels being used every lesson. So if Robin Hamilton is saying, as they disappear, please don't replace them with the same thing but different, I think that's an important message. In a way, I think it's a message probably not for the people who are tuning into this webinar. It's a message that needs to be taken further out into schools with the people who are asking you to use them. And I think there's some very different issues there. The music national curriculum levels, I think, do have very distinct problems with them, which maybe other subjects just haven't had. So I think there's some real key weight behind this message, and it's really nice to have it in writing.
Additionally, I can see some comments coming through to say my school's not getting rid of the levels. I wish they were, was something I just saw. I suppose what we're asking you to think about today is making the assessment that you do ethically good for the community. That community includes yourself. Obviously, it includes the children at the centre of this. And sometimes it might be that you might have to take on some things which the school are asking, but still find ways to value children's work and to show them that this is being valued in other ways.
And I think it's important as well that another question I'll touch on in a bit is what is the purpose of the assessment? And I think there's some real big questions with thinking about what the assessment is for and what it's going to do. And I do hear all sorts of horror stories about the fact that the real purpose of assessments being done in music education seeming to be sticks with which to beat the teacher rather than provide any useful information for the kids.
I just spotted a comment coming up as well, which we should pick up on, Martin. It says levels are easy for parents to understand. And that's quite an interesting point for music.
It is, but then they might be easy to understand because they're cumulative and progressive in that sense. But do they really get, somebody's just said, I don't think parents really know what level 5, etc. really mean. And so I think there's an issue there. Some parents, I'm sure, collect them and simply for school gate boasting material. Whereas what the really useful information, I don't think, is contained within just a simple numerical level statement that the parents can have. They might nod and look like they understand them, but what does it tell them about the musicality of the assessment?
One of the joys of doing the ISM seminars over the last few weeks with the primary teachers has been discovering that not very many of them have to actually allocate levels, which seems like a really great thing. And I keep saying to them, let's try and leave it like this, so that the assessment in this numerical way is still hands-off, but the assessment in terms of how children know what they've got to do, in terms of formative feed forward, if you like, is actually linked more to that.
Yeah, let's move on. So one of the things that we'd like integrated learning to consider are the things that we're putting up on this slide at the moment. So there's a whole variety of musical processes, which are the what parts of this, which then move through to the ways in which there's another how before there's another what, which move through to the ways in which we think about knowledge and understanding. And notice that the desired knowledge and understanding box is a vertical box, if you want to think of it that way. It's running across all of the various musical activities which are being done. The questions that the teacher is being asked under skills and approaches to developing skills are the ways in which the things which are being done musically are then going to translate into knowledge. Now, we know from work with, for example, teacher training students, they find it much easier to plan for activity than they do to plan for learning. And so one of the things that we're trying to unpick in this part of the framework is what really is the learning that's going on as distinct from the doing.
Right. The second side of the framework, the right-hand side, if you like, we've kind of split it here for ease, relates to things like the curriculum materials. Now, sometimes the curriculum materials come first. I work quite a lot in primary, and sometimes in primary I'm told what the topic might be. And so to some extent, some of those curriculum materials emerge from that. Or it may be that we are doing a project, I've just been doing something with English Folk Dance and Song Society, which is specifically related to folk, and the material had to come from the digital archive. So it could be that the curriculum materials to some extent come first, but obviously get added to, but we still need to think about, as Martin was saying, all of these other interrelated activities, the singing, the playing, particularly the improvising, which I'd like to certainly see more of.
There's interesting comments that just come out from Liz Wrighton, who said that instrumental reports, the parents get skills comments, not levels. So already in music education, we're differentiating between types of musical input in that sense. So I think there's all sorts of things that are going on. There's so many disparate practices that I think are quite important for us to consider. And yet again, are pointing out that a one-size-fits-all isn't going to work.
And also, as somebody else has just pointed out, we need to be wary of just skills.
Oh, absolutely.
So
yeah.
There's a lot more to it than this. As we kind of progress through the framework, we come towards some of the points related to assessment. And what we're really trying to say is that you need to think out what it is that you actually want, and then think about what's the best way to assess this. And this assessment is multi-layered. It can come through children's responses, through them talking, through them creating and making, through them notating music, all sorts of different ways. There's some examples given here. Another thing to say about this framework is that it's supposed to be flexible. It gives you some starting points, but there are other things, having thought about values, that you may actually want to consider as activities and strands which you also want to assess as an outcome from this.
One of the things that we've tried to produce are these example statements, and it's very important that these aren't seen as falling into Robin Hamilton's trap of simply replicating national curriculum levels with examples, statements that we're providing, and we've deliberately gone out of our way not to do that. But there are a set of statements there because we are quite aware that teachers do need something concrete upon which to build. And so the point of the example statements is to provide assessment criteria statements against which judgments can be made. Now, these obviously need finally honing in the sense of the sorts of work that you are doing in your schools. But what we've tried to provide are statements which are open to some sort of differentiated outcome in terms of the way that they're used. And so that's the point. That's how they can be used.
So we've been thinking about different ways to show these. If you have a look at Martin's blog, there's certainly some things on there about how you might be able to track these. For example, you may wish to use, I've heard this in lots of different ways, either 3-point, 5-point, or even up to 10-point scales, which seems a little bit excessive, I have to say, but working towards, working at and working beyond. Now, Ofsted brought out some guidance last week about what they might be expecting to see in terms of assessment. And I've summarised this kind of in a cannibalised way, so apologies if anybody from Ofsted is listening in, because I just wanted to get this into some manageable bullet points. But basically, it makes it very clear in there that the curriculum should be published, although it doesn't actually say what that publication looks like. And when the curriculum being published just means the titles or the learning expectations or what that might be.
Or the whole thing.
Yeah.
Or we just don't, well, I'm not clear on that.
No,
so happy to be put right on that.
Yeah, and also that the curriculum, they should be broad and balanced, which is great news for things like music education.
The notion of pupils being set aspirational targets is an interesting one. One of the things that I think is very useful, it's almost an exercise, but perhaps a little bit more than an exercise, is when teachers think about to what level, that's probably the wrong word, to what assessment stage, what sorts of attainment can be achieved from what I'm doing in this particular program of study. And so is the program of study itself limiting attainment? So if I'm using this program of study, am I placing a sort of glass ceiling on what the pupils can do? And so the aspirational target notion comes from the fact that we should really be moving beyond that and thinking through into ways in which the pupils can take their learning forward and not be delimited by the programme of study which is being offered to them.
Just to pick up a point here from Simon Parker, the reference for the guidance for inspectors is at the end. We've linked all of the slides from sources at the end of the presentation, so hopefully you'll be able to pick that up from there, but it's on the Ofsted website. The guidance makes it quite clear that both formative and summative judgments are important, and it talks about how leadership will be wanting to, or will have to know about the formative and summative judgments that are being made. The guidance also says that inspectors will spend more time looking at children's work, or when we say looking at in music, obviously we're thinking about listening to, which kind of jumps a couple of bullet points. But if an assessment system draws upon a wide range of evidence over time, and it has to be moderated with other people to show consistency, then to me that means that we can't just hold effective numbers, and we actually have to have physical examples of children's work going through the process.
And I think it's an important notion that baseline judgments are required, because one of the things that I think is really important is to work out what the kids really can do, what they know, what they're able to do, what they understand. And I don't think this can be administered in a simple 5-minute test. Now, one of the things that I'm often asked is, will I please reinvent the Bentley test for the 21st century? And I really think that this is problematic in all sorts of ways. And I think that really to be effective, baseline judgments need to take place over time. I don't think you can do them effectively in about 10 minutes in the first lesson that you see the kids in. I think you need to spend time working with them, working out what they can do, and then working out what is going to be needed next. Now, obviously, for people who've been in schools for a while, they will have some information to build on. But I do think that the notion of a baseline, and we've talked in the past in music education a lot about transition units, is to really think about what those involve.
That also includes, obviously, in primary schools. I've just seen something come up from Jackie Schneider. What baseline assessment do people do in primary? And it's exactly the same. I'm sure, Jackie, having met you, that as a teacher, in the first few lessons when you're working with children coming into school for the first time, you're doing lots and lots of practical stuff with them. And from that, and from your observations, and it's that kind of gut reaction some of the time, and that on the who's assessment, as we've called it in the document, but that's really, really important that the teacher radar is kind of scanning around and collecting those kinds of things from younger children as well as children going into secondary school.
It's interesting, Anna Gower's just said our baseline is a practical project, but it takes probably the whole of year 7 to get it right. Now, I'm sure that for some teachers, their SLDs are going to want it a bit earlier than at the end of year 7, but I do think it's important that it's not available at the end of year 1 of whatever year it is that you're baselining with. It does take time to establish. But then, having established, then you're able to move on, and you can then look at progression in the ways in which you can see, well, the kids, I know what it was like when they started. Now I can see how they've moved on. I think just a little moment on the last bullet is worth thinking about internal and external standardisation and moderation. In many cases, music is taught by a very small number of people in schools. So we can presume that if it's the same person all the time, then their judgment isn't probably going to vary very much between years. But how does this vary between schools? Are expectations broadly similar? Now, we've said that a one-size-fits-all policy doesn't work, but it certainly, for many teachers, it'd be quite salutary going to talk to other teachers in their area. And this is a thing that hubs can, should, and in many cases are doing, which is allowing teachers the chance to network and actually find some of these things out. So I know that an awful lot of hubs are working on assessments with their teachers, and this is one of the things that the teachers and the hubs can do together. Another
point on that is that one thing I've noticed is that some schools collect a lot of data and sometimes recordings, thankfully, as well, to show a proper pupil profile, and some of our trainees have been using either iDocio or they've been hyperlinking on Excel spreadsheets to do that. But at the end of that year, having collected all that data, it almost goes into a black hole. And the next teacher in the next year group in year 5 or year 8 or wherever it is they're moving to actually almost finds themselves starting again. So if they are moving teacher, how can we make this go with a child, so that there's also, between the school years, that consistency as well.
Absolutely.
So
let's just give you some questions that we've revisited from earlier on, which may have been when we were operating in silence. So let's just go over them a little bit. So some questions for you to consider. So what do I value in music education in my school?
That might include some of the things around extracurricular as well as co-curricular, as we were talking about.
What do I want from the music curriculum in my school? And there's a question there about what the music curriculum entails. As Ali said, is extracurricular, or is that part of the curriculum? How do you view it? There's some important questions there for teachers to ask. That
also links to the way that children perceive themselves as musicians, whether they are musical or not, whether they consider their whole musical self, or whether just their musical self in the classroom, or whether they devalue themselves musically because of that.
How do I value young people's whole musical lives? Quite difficult to do, but I think one of the things that is worth looking at is what is going on in young people's whole musical lives, and how can that then be valued in the classroom, and what can be done with that information once you've found it out.
The music curriculum in the school, I've been thinking quite a lot about this recently. We are in a position in the UK, or certainly in England, where a vast majority of children don't study music formally through either GCSE, BTEC or NCFE at the end of the Key Stage 3. So I think teachers need to think very, very carefully, in particular in Key Stage 3, about what is music education actually for. Is it about lots of different pathways so that children become lifelong lovers of music? Is it just about them being able to do GCSE, which I hope that it isn't, but I think it's things that we certainly need to go back and consider.
We want to consider now a little bit more detail about assessment, attainment and progression, and just try and unpick, if we can, but also problematise some of the ways in which that's being done. There's lots of questions coming in on the sidebar. We're trying to answer them as we go along, but I'm also aware of the fact that we have a dedicated slot, so all sorts of interesting things going on. It's nice that you're talking to each other as well, and I think there's some really nice things happening there, so nice to see. Let's go back to that statement from Robin Hamilton, 16th of June, and let's really think about what this means. Using levels and sub-levels to try to prove pupils' ongoing progress in music doesn't work. As Ofsted has pointed out many times, it's usually superficial, time-wasting and neither reliable nor valid. It's most certainly not any kind of Ofsted requirement. To be absolutely clear, our inspectors do not expect to see it. There are no and never were sub-levels in music anyway, for good reason. And I think this is a really powerful statement from Ofsted, and this is such an important thing that we need to be going and waving in front of senior leadership teams. We really, really do need to be looking into what's going on. Are there levels in your school? Are there sub-levels? What's the point of them? What do they do? And it's important that whoever it is that's asking for them understands that they don't exist and that they have no validity either. So once again, some questions. Now, the question that leads this slide, it isn't maybe the one that's most obvious. So the first question here is, why are you assessing? So this really does need you to think about it. Now, I know for many teachers, the reason that you're assessing is because the deputy head has asked you for your assessment data by next Friday. So that's the reason you're assessing. But who is that assessment for then? Is the assessment for the deputy head? In which case, what sort of an assessment is it? And so the final question on this slide is, do you think you're assessing attainment or do you think you're assessing progress?
I think there's an interesting point coming from James here that says, as I alluded to earlier, the tail is wagging the dog, whole school reports to parents need reforming. Well, school systems are quite difficult things to challenge, but if we can try and find ways in which we can think out these things and go along with an answer and say, I'm assessing in this way because it's better for the children, and the stuff that then goes through to the parents could look different. And if you come up with solutions, then perhaps that's another another way to tackle this.
Indeed. Solutions, but also problematising it for the SLT so that they don't get the feeling it's simple, straightforward and a done deal. Here's some things that are worth thinking about, and these are quite difficult questions. Are you assessing progress as distance travelled towards a known destination? Are you assessing progress as distance travelled from a known starting point? And are you assessing attainment according to fixed milestones? I'll unpick each of these in a minute, but they are very different. Progress and attainment are often used almost synonymously, but there are problems with them. And sometimes what I see are teachers splicing two or more of these together, because that does have an effect on assessment. That's really an important set of questions to be asking.
Now, there's a set of roadmaps coming up here, according to Martin, all roads lead to Birmingham.
Well, Birmingham is obviously the centre of the country, the centre of the universe, and is the most significant place in the UK. So I'm sure that anybody who's currently in Birmingham is thoroughly aware of that, and all those of you who are not in Birmingham, which includes me at the moment, are clearly regretting it.
Before we move on, can we just pick up Anna's point here?
Yeah.
Can those of us help schools to challenge systems? So I think partly that relates to what I was saying earlier, but I know that some people are creating different models. There's a school where I live, Brighton, who have managed to get away from having Fisher Family Trust data as their baseline assessment. So the nonsense of that and how that relates to music, and they fought their corner, and now that's starting to become listened to by other schools. What we actually need is people to say, I've done this, I'm changing this, let's talk about it, and coming up with concrete examples. And
so I was just reading from a teacher who says Twitter has been frowned upon recently by my school. I don't think we're advocating school-based Twitter accounts, but certainly as music teachers, I think there's an awful lot of professional development that takes place if you follow the right people in Twitter. Now, I think that's separate from the idea of having a school Twitter account, which I can understand has all sorts of safeguarding issues, etc. But then I do think that for music teachers CPD, Twitter is actually quite useful.
Lisa says we should be able to use baseline tests as a starting point. And I think what Martin and I are saying to you is that you definitely need your own musical baseline tests. I'm not interested in anything batches, as I was asked one year when I observed this kind of lesson. But actually musically, what can children do? What do they know? What can they understand? And if linked to that, you also have to play the game. Is that the right expression? With levels, then you need to find a way through that. But actually, for your own credibility and for your knowing where the children need to go next, and kind of creating a music education which is great for them, you will need to know that. That's absolutely the case.
So this is the first of the Birmingham pictures, which is attainment according to fixed milestones. Now, if you look on, if you're not intimately familiar with the geography of the West Midlands, then you might want to look at the graphic on the right of this slide, which takes from a fixed starting point, which in this case is Dorridge, and I don't know why I chose Dorridge because I don't live there at all, and then moves through a series of fixed staging posts to end up at a fixed finishing point. Now, what this requires is a fixed starting point. In other words, all the pupils have to be in Dorridge before they move on to point B, fixed staging post 1 just outside Fautley. Then they move on to fixed staging post, the next one, which is in Small Heath, which is point C. Then I chose point D, Perry Bar, because that's where Birmingham City University is. And then finally, you might want to end up in Sutton Coldfield for the shopping. But these are very fixed points. You're taking all the pupils with you on the journey as you do it. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong in this system, but I'm saying that this is an example in terms of the way that people think about attainment as being done according to fixed milestones. Different from this is the idea of progress as distance travelled towards a known destination. So in other words, instead of the fixed one that we had before, we now know where we want to end up, but we don't really know where we're starting from. So this is the point of baseline assessment, because knowing where you want to end up, this is the statement, you can choose whatever you want to do, but I put what a year 9 pupil looks or sounds like in my school. Now, that's I think to some degree that's a negotiated finishing point, because that's what you chose. The baseline shows you where the kids are, and then you're choosing the staging points that you're going to go through en route, depending on what your baseline showed them, in order to get to that finishing point. Yep.
A few questions to pick up.
Yeah, I was hoping that you're picking up the questions, and I'm whistling about roadmaps.
Yeah.
So the final one of these is assessing progress as distance travelled from a known starting point. So this time we're starting in Birmingham, and then we're going all over the place. But the kids are choosing their journey. They're choosing where they're going to. So you know where the kids are. You've established this through the baseline. But then the pupils have some agency in terms of what they're doing. So assessment here becomes distance travelled from the starting point. Now, this could well be an open-ended journey. So there's all sorts of things that can be going on here. But the point is that this is now assessment as distance travelled from.
The point here is that one of the questions that you had earlier was about the 14-year-old, what does the year 3, Key Stage 3, end of Key Stage 3 people look like. But actually what we're saying here is, what do the range of pupils look like? So this is not looking for a one-size-fits-all approach, and it's giving more autonomy and perhaps what John Finney, I think, described as the negotiated curriculum to some extent. So that's where the third model goes with that. Picking up points here, Anna, sorry to keep harping on, but my school is incredibly supportive, yet still won't budge. It's levels for all. Sometimes in some schools they've started kind of clubbing together and saying across creative arts we're going to be doing this, or across a group of subjects. So, you know, safety in numbers in that sense that you might be able to get some leverage, if you like. But also, I know, Anna, that you have to report levels, but I also know that you do loads and loads of really good quality formative assessments, which helps the pupils to learn. And so one of the things we've talked a lot about in this seminar over the last few days, and one of the things we've been talking about is what are the range of formative assessment strategies which people are using.
And I think it's really important that all of the things that we're putting up here, all of the roadmaps, all of the talk, don't just treat them as summative assessments. Formative assessment in music is absolutely fundamental, and we've been doing it for donkey's years, and we do know how to do it. Now, I appreciate that there's problems with capturing this in terms of evidence, but it is really important that teacher judgments, formative assessments, are recognised. And in that quotation from Ofsted that was put up, goodness knows how many slides ago, the importance of formative assessment was recognised in the way that Ofsted will be doing this with schools. And so music teachers should be in a strong position for this.
Additionally, linked to that is what we were talking about earlier, in that teachers should be in a strong position to be actually showing physical examples through sound, through video, of what children can do, and the discussion that goes on alongside that to help move that process on. So I think one of the things that could be done by teachers is to think about reclaiming assessment in terms of what they're actually doing. So let's go back to that question about what is the purpose of this assessment. So is the purpose of assessment to help the pupils? Is it to audit attainment, or is it to show progress? And if you do have to report using national curriculum levels, then that's what you're going to have to do. It might help clarify the thinking if as teachers, one of the things that we do is we really think about the notion of purpose. We think about helping pupils. We think about whether we're auditing attainment or we're showing progress. And maybe we try not to do too many things all in one go. Are the national curriculum levels that we're reporting and using, are we conflating some of these? Are there ways that we can make life easy for us in the way that we do them? So how do these affect the assessment undertaken? And one of the things that I think is important is to try and disentangle what I often see, which is the assessment lesson. And instead of taking the assessment level as the sole judge of what is done, that we try and go for more ongoing ways in the ways that we've been talking about. So here's some questions that are worth working through.
and really worth thinking about in terms of what you're doing. So questions for yourself, and then maybe to share with SLTs. What do I want to assess in music education? And somebody earlier on wrote about the tail wagging the dog. So what do you want to assess, and why do you want to assess it? Then think about who it's for. We've touched on this already. Who is it for? Is it the pupil, the teachers, parents, the system? Who is that assessment for?
Linked to that is who actually gets a say in this assessment. Whose voice is the assessment formed from? Is it just from yours? Is it just from yours and the pupils? Do the instrumental teachers get any say in this? Does the children's musical life from outside of the classroom come into this? The reason that's kind of crucially important is because sometimes I go into schools and I see young people who are really great musicians in the sense of being authentic musicians outside of the classroom who don't consider themselves to be musical enough, because the music which they've done in school doesn't really help bring in their musical skills, knowledge and expertise, if you like, from outside the classroom, which makes them form judgments on themselves, which say, I'm a 5A, but I'm a 6C in drama, so I'm going to do drama, even though I'm a great singer-songwriter, all that kind of thing.
But I see that as well in primary school teachers and some secondary school teachers who also say, well, there are things that I just can't do. And yet when we try and unpick some of the things that are going on and that people are able to do, we find that they are actually quite able to do this. I do think there are concerns all round in terms of what we mean by music and musical, and that's another of the bullet points later on. We've talked about learning and doing, but one of the things that I think is useful is the notion of specific assessment criteria for each of these. Now, we've been talking about what Ofsted said are good. I think we can actually now be a little bit critical of Ofsted, because some years ago there was talk about rewrite national curriculum level statements into pupil speak, which teachers then did and then were chided when they'd done them because they didn't look like the originals. But I think sometimes now, some of the things I see where people have crowbarred things into their national curriculum level, it might be useful instead to just take a step back and think, what's the very specific learning that I'm doing in this task, in this project, and in this scheme of work, rather than trying to force the national curriculum language onto it, assess what the learning has been, and then work out separately how that can then be used for the notion that was always there about best fit in terms of assessment.
There's a point that's just come up here from John about evidencing informal assessments, building on Jackie Schneider's point earlier that she informally assesses every minute of the teaching. She's tweaking and adapting all the time as she goes along, but how do you actually evidence that? And I certainly know of a few strategies which people use for that kind of thing, and sometimes that brings the pupil voice in, or getting the pupils to kind of make their own criteria and decide, have conversations, record those kinds of things. But actually it is incredibly difficult to be able to do that when you're like a battery farmer in either a primary school or a secondary school and you've got 150 children a day walking past your door.
I think as well it's important that we reclaim formative assessment, because I'm convinced in music education we were doing formative assessment before it had been invented. And then other people have come along and told us we're doing it wrong, and I think they're wrong. I think we're doing it right. So I do think we need to reclaim formative assessment. Ofsted are now looking for it. I think we should now be saying, no guys, we know what formative assessment is. Go way, way back to when the first, it was called Key Stage 3 strategy materials then were produced. They chose a music lesson. Now that's almost unheard of in terms of a national initiative. Why was a music lesson chosen? Because we could do formative assessment. Nobody needed special training. Now, I think that's been taken away from us. We do need to reclaim the fact that we're good at formative assessment and insist on that.
We were looking at the weekend at a handout which I have been gathering ways in which I know that I use formative assessment in the classroom, and there's already, I think, more than 40 on this. So there's a lot of strategies which I think you probably automatically use for formative assessment, and perhaps some which at another point we can put up for discussion and sharing and ideas.
Absolutely, and I think those are important. But as well as that, other teachers need to know that these are all perfectly normal things that we do in music education, but they might not be for them. And I think that's important.
Somebody's just put up, I think it's Anna's just put up, how do you know you're making progress? My music sounds better, miss. And earlier, I saw something come through, and it may again have been from Anna, about where is the evidence? Actually, it's in the music. You know, if we listen to the music in week 2 and we get some direct target setting, which links again to what Ofsted were talking about, then a little bit further down the line, there's conversations going on all the time between the pupils themselves, which you're listening into, and collecting music examples. And yes, that evidence does come through the music as well as
and I think it's
other ways.
Sorry, I think it's important as well that exists both as tangible and intangible evidence. And I appreciate there's problems with intangible. But what we really need to do is to make sure that we've got musical evidence. But not just for the sake of assessments. I do know one of my PGC students was telling me this year about the assessment in their school, where the kids were recorded in the final assessment lesson, but then they never actually listened to those recordings. And I do think that it's useful, exactly as whoever it was Anna was saying, that my music's got better. If you can maintain, I appreciate that there's an enormous job here to do, but we do have technology on our side. If we can get kids listening to what they've done and keeping it and talking about it as they're going along, that's a really powerful strategy, and that helps them. And then another thing I found is when I've done some work with teachers and kids in schools, is when they listen to a recording of their own music, they're able to take a step back. Rather than immediately they've played it and the teacher talks to them, if instead of doing that, they then listen to the recording, the kids are able to take a step back and really think about what's going on in it. And so there's some important things in terms of that.
James has just asked, where do you collect informal information, informal and formal assessments from the VLE, Shobi, SoundCloud, all of those places? I already mentioned iDocio. We've been using that quite a lot with our trainees. They've been building musical profiles. The great thing about that, and also about Excel, is we can write formative comments, we can mail merge them, we can send them off. It can all be automated so that there's actual proper targets rather than a number for people to think, have you thought about this, or those kinds of things.
I'm just looking at one there from John, who said the idea of formative assessment, the advice from the teacher. I've used the example before. If you go and watch a guitar, Perry, teach a lesson to 4 or 5 kids, then a kid plays their piece. You can't see my hands, can you? Hold on. And then the kids played this is me miming air guitar now. I'm really good at air guitar. The kid does their piece, and then the teacher says, the Perry says to them, okay, that was really good. That was a level 4B. Next. That's not what goes on. They're going to talk about the fingering technique. They're going to talk about the right hand technique. They're going to talk about all sorts of things. They're not just going to say, that was a 4B, next. And so I think it's really important that we do the same. Those formative comments given to the guitar kid are the same as what we're doing in classroom music.
Also using videos, something else I've been using is called Coach's Eye. I don't know if you come across that. Shameless and Nick from sport. Right. Where you can put videos next to each other. So for things like technique, you can see how it was 3 weeks ago, and they can put up a video and see themselves literally side by side of how things are. Yeah. But
for us it's a sidebar. All people are giving all sorts of comments on how this can be done. And I think that's important, because one of the things that I'm very aware of is teachers who have an enormous workload. I know in one of the schools in which I was head of department, one of the music teachers had to write 700 reports. So I'm very aware that to try and produce 700 sets of formative statements, I think that's important, that we try and make it manageable. And we put kids in charge of their own learning as well. And if they've really thought about it, this helps them, because then they can talk about what's going on. So I think that's important. Sorry, I'm getting distracted again, reading everything that's going on in the sidebar, which looks really, really interesting.
James has been asking about blogs and safe blogs, and I think there are some answers that have come up through this for that. But I know we've been using, it'll come back to me in a minute, with primary.
Something.
Yeah, something.
Right. Okay, should we do some more questions? Sorry, I'm looking at my watch at the same time and very aware that time marches on. So questions really for teachers again. Are you planning what you want the pupils to learn, or are you planning what you will be assessing? And one of the things that we're talking all the time, I'm not sure if it's come across, but in our discussions about what we're doing here today and elsewhere, is the notion of planning for learning and planning for assessment. And the planning for learning should really drive what is being assessed. Now, all sorts of people have talked about teachers who find things that are easy to assess and then assess them. But I think really big questions, what is it that you want the pupils to learn? And then surely the point of assessment is in helping the kids to actually be able to get there.
Linked to that, I suppose, is the idea of it being progressive. So that we're on a spiral curriculum and we're not just going round in circles. To quote your Cook's tour.
Yes, so we're not. I have trouble with the word progressive because it carries elements of being trendy, which is sort of disparaged in some quarters. But we're using progressive in that sense of sort of progressional, if that works as a word, so that we want progression to be taking place. So yes, there's all sorts of curriculum models. We can have spirals if we like. We can have ladders. I've seen snakes and ladders being used, which is fascinating. So all sorts of things. But how is progress being planned for? Some other bullets here. What is it you want the pupils to know, do, and understand? Have you delineated that? Have you actually put that as a statement? So, do you plan for this and then plan assessment accordingly? Have you thought about what it is that is going on? There's one that's just come up from Jackie, who says, I see so many formal assessments that do absolutely nothing to help either kids or teachers. Yeah. This is my point from earlier on. This is assessment for the system. Because it's not actually helping anybody. It's just a systemic view of assessment. There's no point in it other than it's fed into an Excel spreadsheet somewhere. And that's a problem. So, and the final question on this slide, what's your expectation for the full range of key stages that you teach? So that's the full range of attainment, the full range of key stages. What are you expecting in terms of what's going on in your assessments?
I suppose at the end of the day, it comes back to that thing about the values and thinking out what it is that you want to have in your key stage 1, 2 or 3 curriculum and how that might link to other things which go on in your school. And then thinking about the assessment, not right at the end as a bolt-on, but certainly thinking out those other things first and thinking what is it that you want rather than I can assess this, what shall we do? Yes, absolutely. I think that's important. Very aware now that 5 o'clock is being reached and there's an awful lot of questions that people have got that we haven't had a chance to answer. In true broadcast style, we've just been handed a note by the producer that says, I can email you any questions that you don't have time to answer if you like. And I think we'd quite like to have a go at doing that. Maybe one of the things that we could think about, we'll find ways of doing that, but we can either do this, sorry to go all jargony, synchronously or asynchronously. And people talked about Twitter earlier on. One of the ways that I think Twitter is a very powerful tool is when we use Twitter synchronously and people have comments, ask each other questions, and we're able to respond to them in that way. But we'll have a discussion about that, and we'll talk to the producer about what we're going to do with the questions and how we can get on to meet them. Somebody's just asked, can you send out the slides? They're going to be available. Yeah, they're definitely going to be available. They'll be up there. Somebody else has asked for a Twitter list. We'll see what we can be able to do that. Will we be able to access a copy of all of these comments? The comments have been archived, as I understand, and they should be available there. And so all of those things, hopefully, there you go. And the answer is popped up as if by magic. Thank you, producer, in the sidebar. I think Martin and I are both keen to leave you with the idea that when used well, assessment can be such a powerful thing in a music education. And I think it's thinking out, how do I play the system which is going on in my school and yet make the assessment really, really relevant and worthwhile for the young people. Absolutely. So I think at this point we're going to have to wave goodbye. Hope you have a very pleasant evening wherever you are, Birmingham and all other known places. Centre of the universe. Thanks. Okay. Thank you, Martin. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Bye.